Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. President Trump has abandoned plans to nominate John Ratcliffe as Director of National Intelligence. Trump tapped Ratcliffe, a Republican Congress member from Texas, to replace the outgoing Dan Coats. Speaking to reporters, Trump blamed the media for its scrutiny of Ratcliffe's record as the cause of his decision to withdraw his nomination.
And I could see that the press was treating him, I thought, very unfairly. He's an outstanding man. And I asked him, I said, do you want to go through this for 2 or 3 months, or would you want me to maybe do something else? And he thought about it. I said, it's going to be rough. I could see exactly where the press is going. And fake news.
Critics denounced Ratcliffe as an unqualified partisan who had inflated his own professional background. That seems like a very fair assessment, but perhaps that scrutiny that Ratcliffe received should apply to intelligence officials across the board. Joining me is Ned Price, former special assistant to President Obama and former CIA analyst, currently director of policy and communications at the group National Security Action. Welcome, Ned. You were vocally opposed to Ratcliffe's candidacy. Your response now to President Trump withdrawing it?
Well, I was vocally opposed for several different reasons. One, he was woefully unqualified. Two, he was a hyper-partisan in a position that requires someone who transcends partisanship to the extent that one can in high degrees and high positions of government in D.C. And three, he clearly, at the very least, embellished his credentials, and I think there's good reason to believe he actively misled and even lied about his track record when it came to his work as a federal prosecutor. So I wasn't actually too surprised to see that Trump never went forward with this nomination. I think it's important to remember he was never formally nominated. Trump floated his name on Twitter, and I also wasn't all that surprised to hear Trump say yesterday that there really wasn't any formal vetting. In fact, he acknowledged that he threw out a name and allowed our public discourse and the media to do its work. And I think that work was very evident over the course of the past few days when Ratcliffe's resume started to fall apart. So the fact that both the president and John Ratcliffe appeared to agree that this wouldn't be best going forward, I think is not all that surprising.
The office itself, the Director of National Intelligence, I've heard criticism or concerns from people familiar with the intelligence community that the importance of that role has been overblown, that it's not like being the director of the CIA or the FBI. What exactly does someone do in that position?
Well, you're right that the office doesn't have much of an operational role, but at its best, it can have an important coordinating function within the intelligence community. The office was designed to be a very light layer on top of what is already a sprawling intelligence bureaucracy of 16 departments and agencies. And the best DNIs have served in that coordinating function. They've removed themselves from the operational decisions on the part of the agency, the CIA, or other intelligence components, and instead have focused on the strategic elements of the job. That is to say, ensuring that resources, precious resources, in fact, are being used appropriately across the departments and agencies to ensure that we're trained on the right targets, to ensure that we're looking over the horizon. The DNI, importantly, also oversees the presidential daily briefing. That's the book that is briefed to the president almost every day he is in D.C. And so the DNI has quite a bit of say over what goes in that document that is not only briefed to the president, but also to the president's top national security staff. So, the DNI in some ways has been compared to the Pope. The Pope doesn't control any battalions. He doesn't have a 1,000,000-man army, but he does carry a lot of authority. And the best DNIs have wielded that authority effectively.
One criticism that I find questionable when it comes to Ratcliffe is that he was skeptical of the Russia investigation. Now, I get that he is a partisan, and Trump obviously saw the Russia investigation as a way to delegitimize his presidency. But I don't think that skepticism of the intelligence community is disqualifying, even for a director of national intelligence. And I'd say even actually especially for a director of national intelligence. It's good to have a healthy skepticism of what intelligence community officials tell us.
Well, I think we have to distinguish between two things. I think we have to distinguish someone who has a healthy skepticism, which at its core, I agree, would be an important element of that job. Look, every CIA director I served under, and I served under several, brought a healthy and constructive skepticism to the job. Didn't just blindly accept what you were telling them. The question we often got was, how do we know that? Are we sure? And the answer we would give is that nothing is sure. Nothing is science when it comes to intelligence. What we deal in is analysis. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out today. I think what we saw with Ratcliffe wasn't this healthy, constructive skepticism. It was his identity as a partisan, hyper-partisan, I should say, defender of and cheerleader for the president. It wasn't that he was skeptical of the high confidence intelligence assessments regarding Russia because he was just pushing and prodding to make sure that the I's had been dotted and the T's had been crossed. I think what we've learned over the last few days is that he's been largely absent from the House Intelligence Committee. He hasn't traveled on congressional delegations. He hasn't spent much time with the intelligence agencies. He hasn't even been to all of the most important hearings. So I think it's outlandish to say that John Ratcliffe looked at the voluminous information that the intelligence organizations and agencies sifted through and came to a different conclusion. No, he came to a different conclusion based on a single predicate. That is that President Donald Trump was and is his guy, and he would go to bat for him no matter what the high confidence analysis said.
I'm not going to argue that John Ratcliffe is not a partisan. My point here is that I think the problem goes well beyond him, and I'm concerned about the outcry over him obscuring that fact. I mean, take Dan Coates, the outgoing director of national intelligence, who Ratcliffe would have been replacing. He supported the Iraq War. Back in 2017, he called Iran the foremost state sponsor of terrorism, which I think is false. Now, to his credit, he's since backed off of that. I think possibly because he didn't want to enable or help the Trump administration's drive towards war on Iran.
Well, I'll say a couple things about that. One, look, I'm not, as you know, a cheerleader for this administration, but I will say it's undeniable that Iran is a concerning state sponsor of terrorism. I don't think there's any question about that, and it's not just this administration that has made that claim, but previous administrations as well, and we can get into that certainly. But two, I think you're right about one thing. Look, I think in this administration we have a tendency to deify decent individuals, decent men and women, because there are so few of them, especially at the highest ranks of government within this administration. I think Coates could have done more to protect the men and women of the intelligence community that he oversaw. He issued, I think, one sort of milquetoast statement after Trump met with Putin and embraced his worldview in Helsinki. He didn't say anything publicly when Trump pressured him to weigh in with Comey early in the Russia investigation. There have been other stories about Coates keeping his mouth shut. And so I think there is legitimate criticism that he could have done more, knowing that doing more may well have cost him his job much sooner. I will say at the same time, though, that, look, Dan Coates, I think, during this administration spoke truth to power. And he spoke truth to power both privately, as we've read in various accounts, as well as publicly. We wouldn't know to the same extent we do now that Iran was abiding by the terms of the nuclear deal, that the extent of Russia's attack on our democracy in 2016 and the ongoing efforts to denigrate our democracy that we've seen ever since. We wouldn't know that the intelligence agencies have concluded that North Korea is unlikely to denuclearize, something that also set Trump off. And we wouldn't know that climate change, we wouldn't know officially from the intelligence community, I say, that climate change is a national security concern. So, I think he has a very mixed record. I think given where we are in this administration, he's someone I appreciated, especially in that post. And I fear that whoever replaces Dan Coates, and we saw the short-lived specter of John Ratcliffe in that role, may not live up to the expectations, however low they are in this administration, that we had of Dan Coates.